Hello and most welcome to 989, of the Heidegger series. And I am presently out in the woods, and I will take up a little article here that is about non-duality, which is not so easy to understand. It's an article by David Hawkins, not to be confused with Hawkins, who was a physician that passed away 2 or 3 years ago. This is an Englishman as well, and he writes a lot about neurology, things to do with consciousness, psychology, sociology, and so forth. He is very interesting, and the recommendation I got from the beginning happened in a very odd manner. I was sitting at a coffee shop discussing different levels of chaotic organizations, and that there were lower levels of world, so to speak. The world changed. Instead of saying conscious of the world, we said that the world changed. And the one I was talking to asked me, are there any definitions for those things, categories, names? I said, I don't know about them. And there was this young fellow sitting next to us. I didn't see him. His name was, let's see here, Janne Matthias. And it turned out he had a recommendation, and it was actually this David Hawkins. Odd, to say the least, but well worth a try. So here we go. Two perspectives of being in the world, an article coming from the book Letting Go by David Hawkins. The linear, causal, Newtonian and duality way. Sir Isaac Newton, a man of faith in God, came up with a model that assumed that one could cause an object to move through force. Another great invention of him was the differential calculus. Well, that is something discussed. We don't know whether it was Leibniz or Newton who came up with it first. I would bet it was Newton, but I'm just going to put this nota bene into the context. It means that with complex mathematical computation, one could describe processes and geometric figures in a sufficiently accurate way. Part of the industrial era development used this model in a way that one may call worldly success. Hence, such assumptions became adopted, including culture in the world. In this perspective, one is supposed to be into the center of it, trying to cause anything, being responsible for it. From this point of view, one is supposed to be in dynamics where one controls and is the cause of outcomes. One has to invest effort, time and money to achieve something. Action may appear as the way to achieve and have things. Action creates reaction. Force creates counterforce. There may be the perception that one is separate from another. One looks and seeks out there to fill the emptiness within. Needs and values drive one. Hence, solving a conflict is about finding strategies that allow for needs fulfillment and values honoring. In a linear frame of reference, one might have to attack others to fulfill one's needs without the other's consent. It may appear as an animal world fighting for survival, where survival is about dominating others, including killing them. In duality, there might be the assumption that if one fulfills one's needs, one may get happy because of that. Hence, the mind seeks to go from emptiness to fullness, from imperfection to perfection. Although there are physical limits to this linear world, sometimes it seems that because of limiting beliefs, things could not exist, although the possibility exists. Another assumption of the linear view is that things are logical. Those things are caused in a logical sequence. This view is self-confirmed by the domain of science, and there is practicality around logical thinking and operations. One could imagine building a house. First comes the foundation, then one builds the walls, and then the roof, and the logical process goes on. In this separated view, one may unconsciously identify oneself as the source of existence, actions, choices, decisions, that usurping the sovereignty or competition with the divine. Let's now move into the quantum way, and I assumed already from the beginning that was to be one of the very points of his discourse. And this chapter or paragraph is named The Nonlinear Quantum Emergent Way. Speaking of the truth revealing itself as a consequence of a new choice. The world is not governed by Newtonian cause and effect laws. Life and the world are governed by consciousness beyond one's mind. What one feels, how one thinks, acts, the relationship to the world, anything else, including God, is a consequence of one's level of consciousness. Getting back to the linear, the limited, the finite, the science of nonlinear dynamics deals with making one's left brain to understand the right brain. So this is a complexity that involves left brain, right brain, and different ways of understanding. We can talk about the linear, we can talk about operating the limited, and we speak about exclusive and differences, whereas the right brain, the more encompassing part of our neurological system, speaks about wholes, abstractions, generalities, and is inclusive. The left brain is exclusive. Exclusive is often meant that you have an either-or situation. You can't have both at the same time. And this exclusiveness has led to maybe a too advanced way of using abstract thinking by trying to take away things from the wholeness. Similarly, the chaos theory attempts to make sense in what appears to lack logic, to find order in disorder, to find patterns in chaos. The model itself is a consequence of the organizing principle, an attractor. Let's go into how Hawkins see on a mundane and layman perspective or level what they could sort of equal, and he calls them quantum laws. Number one, what one holds in mind tends to manifest. 2. Likes tend to go to likes. 3. The act of observing may change the result of the process by intention. 4. The quantum field is non-local, non-temporal. And he puts another into the fifth. The movement and patterns in the quantum field are governed by karma, or the unconscious. This approach to teaching or understanding is has strongly influenced our understanding of how the human mind functions to form thoughts. Modes of classroom instruction currently in widespread use are based on the outdated robot model, which views the brain as an output-input information storage and processing unit. Computer analogies, however, are unable to account for a few key features of intelligence. One that is central to the learning process, the phenomenon of creative thought formation. Recently, however, a novel theory has been developed which sheds some light on the creative process. This theory conceives creative thoughts as emergent spontaneously from a fabric of sensation and emotion, composed of experiential units called feeling tones. And here we have a new name. According to William Gray, he is the author of the article Understanding Creative Thought Processes. Basic feeling tones, like the primary colors of the rainbow, combine in a nearly infinite number of ways to form a whole spectrum of shades, and these represent all aspects of our internal and external experience. Just as Mozart's 41st Symphony and Beethoven's Ninth may both be played from the same set of musical notes, so to the rich variety of mental experience that bombards our consciousness may be represented by means of the same fundamental set of feeling tones. Like people and cars in a city, these complex feeling tone structures or compositions are always on the move through our brain. Just as a well-designed city allows people to meet one another and form rich sets of associations and relationships, so too the brain provides an environment within which feeling tones are able to link up with one another and spontaneously form more complex combinations of meaningful nature. These syntheses are what we call thoughts. Robot model theorists conceive thoughts to be neuroelectric impulses, which, like the binary coded electrical impulses in a computer circuit, derive their various meanings by traveling along specific wires or nerve fiber pathways. However, this hardwired mechanistic conception unfortunately leads to a physicalistic view of the mind. Well, this is where we are presently in the modern educational system, the system of academia. The robot model, as it's called here by William Gray, is the unanimous picture nowadays. All psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, they have all wholeheartedly accepted this model, and I would say they even accepted it unspokenly, without thinking about it, without even giving it a second thought. It is just there. This is somehow reality. Let me repeat this because it's so good. This is the consensus model bar anyone. There can be no objections to this model because it's an unspoken, unanimously accepted foundation for all talking about these things. It's so fantastically conceived and also verbalized by William Gray. Robot model theories conceive thoughts to be narrow electric impulses which, like binary coded electrical impulses in a computer circuit, derive their various meanings by traveling along specific wires or nerve fiber pathways. However, this hardwired mechanistic conception unfortunately leads to a physicalistic view of the mind, conscious experience being conceived as inextricably bound to the physical architecture of the brain. The feeling tone model, on the other hand, conceives the meaning of thoughts to be intrinsic to thoughts themselves. The information content of a thought being embodied in its specific feeling tone, code, or neuroelectric waveform shape. You see how this also plays very well along with chaos theory, fractal theory. Like their feeling tone relatives, thoughts are on the move too. Thus, mental information is portable and free to move throughout the brain. According to this new view, the brain may be conceived as a kind of sophisticated loom, on which is suited to the weaving of mental fabrics. However, this is a very unusual loom, for these feeling tone tapestries have the unique ability of themselves being able to run the controls of the loom. Thus, the fabric is able to weave itself in a self-determining fashion. Because of this self-referential process, the mind is capable of independent evolution to states of complexity far exceeding that of the biological matrix, the brain. The brain/mind relation in many ways resembles the mother/child, the womb/embryo relation. The brain provides a unique environment within which that living entity, the mind, is spawned. Unlike embryonic development, however, there are no pre-existent chromosome blueprints. Rather, the genes which shape the mental personality are continuously created on the spot. These spontaneous birth events being our creative insights and ideas. It goes without saying that such a model of mental phenomena suggests an approach to education quite different from that currently practiced in schools. According to this approach, understanding is best accomplished through a process of facilitation rather than through rote instruction. Teaching is not a programming process, the feeding of information into computer-like brains. Rather, it is an agrarian process, the acquisition of knowledge being likened to the raising of crops. The teacher's purpose is to provide sunlight, fertilizer, and water, and an environment free of predators in which sensitivity, caring, and curiosity are free to develop. The learning which ensues must be viewed as a birth process, one which must not be rushed. Confusion results if material is delivered at a pace faster than the student can assimilate, since the evoked thoughts require sufficient time to take full root in the student's personal feeling tone fabric that he is perpetually weaving. And the reference here being William Gray, Understanding Creative Thought Processes, an early formulation of the emotional cognitive structure theory. And it goes to show how important emotional patterns and weaving are for remembering, projecting, and also retaining information or knowledge. And then we have from Paul Laviolette, Thoughts About Thoughts, and that's the emotional perceptive cycle theory, and it's coming from Man, Environment, Systems 9. And we also have an article from Paul Laviolette, The Thermodynamics of the Aha Experience. Here we have another article, a review article actually. The authors are Tanaka, Kantner and Bartlett, and it's coming from the University of Victoria in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, and also the Institute for Neural Computation, University of California, San Diego, California, USA. And this is the similarity. We mentioned that before, similarity, identity, and so thing. And I usually say that there is prevailing oversimplification going on in ourselves and in general among people. And that's the very idea that sameness and identity is something incredibly simple. And we almost been using the word sameness in the same careless, sloppy way as we've been talking about, for instance, difference, that careless way that we explained negativity and positivity, the two polar sides. There we somehow assume they are completely equal. So the positive side is completely equal to the negative side. And saying that and thinking that is it's a no-goer, it's a stop of thinking. It does not enter deeply into what it is. And as we've seen from H.H. Clarke, the linguist who studies how children learn expressions, propositions like in, into, out of, we understand that antonyms are not as simple as we think. And this article is actually about what is similarity or sameness. And sameness is not at all as simple as we usually assume. We just say sameness, we say identity, but we don't go any deeper into what it is. And please do that, because it's incredibly much more complicated than you think. And just to say sameness or identity, it's a stopping of the project. It's a little bit like saying, long before you even finished your project or what you're intending to do, to say that, oh, I'm already ready. Everything is finished. I'm ready to go on with the next thing. That's an exaggeration, and it presupposes something that has not still happened. And by doing so, we stop the process of understanding, thinking, and knowing. And this article takes up the incredibly problematic nature of self-similarity and similarity in general. And faces are a very good starting point. And this is something I really understood already when we started Paul Ekman, the Swedish relative, the guy with the Swedish ancestry, who took up what on earth is really this thing called Sameness. How do we recognize, for instance, anger as always being anger in a person, joy, happiness? And it turns out it is a very complex process. And in this example, we have a cloning going from the actor Robert Downey Jr. and he's slowly cloned into George Clooney, which I think is funny, and I think that is possibly intended that his name is actually Clooney. I think this is marvelously funny. I also noticed this going on the net. He was a famous comedian who was very good at imitating people to the exactness. And when he was as best as imitating people, some bastard tricked me by cloning the person's face a little bit towards the person he was imitating. And it was so interesting how the whole perception that he was good in imitating the other person got even stronger. I don't remember his name. I'll see if I can find a link to him, but he used to be one of the cast members in Saturday Night Live. But it goes to show when the likeness of the face became more protruding, you got the image that he was the same person, that his imitation gone beyond all belief. Later, I understood that somebody has been fiddling about these programs that copies but let's cut to the chase. Let's get into the article. Here we have the introduction, and I will give you a clue, because sameness is never more pertinent, more important when it comes to sameness of faces. How do we recognize the people we know? And how do we understand that there are people we don't know? And how do we understand that they are strangers? For me personally, that's extra interesting, because after my accident, I had a great problem understanding who I know and who I did not know. And you could say, was somehow my fractality gone downwards, and I could not reach into the same possibility to read off people's faces to understand sameness. But let's start. Tanaka writes like this, James William Tanaka. Why do some faces appear more similar than others? Beyond structural factors, we speculate that similarity is governed by the organization of faces located in a multidimensional face space. To test this hypothesis, we morphed a typical face with an atypical face. If similarity judgments are guided purely by their physical properties, the morph should be perceived to be equally similar to its typical parent as its atypical parent. However, contrary to the structural prediction, our results show that the morph face was perceived to be more similar to the atypical face than the typical face. Our empirical studies show that the atypical bias is not limited to faces, but extends to other object categories, for instance birds, whose members share common shape properties. We also demonstrate atypicality bias is malleable and can change subject to category learning and experience. Collectively, the empirical evidence indicates that perceptions of face and object similarity are affected by the distribution of stimuli in a face or object space. In this framework, atypical stimuli are located in a sparser region of the space where there is less competition for recognition, and therefore these representations capture a broader range of inputs. In this framework, atypical stimuli are located in a sparser region of space where there is less competition for recognition, and therefore these representations capture a broader range of inputs. In contrast, typical stimuli are located in denser region of category space where there is increased competition for recognition, and hence these repetitions draw a more restricted range of face inputs. These results suggest that the perceived likeness of an object is influenced by the organization of surrounding exemplars in category space. In the figure 1, as I already shown you, we saw the faces of two well-known actors, Robert Downey Jr. and George Clooney, and the morph face created by averaging the two parent images together. The morph face represents a curious puzzle. Although the morph child face receives equal contribution from its celebrity parents, it bears a stronger likeness to one parent than the other. In this example, most people would agree that the morph face looked more like Robert Downey Jr. If the image is a 50-50 morph of George Clooney and Robert Downey Jr., what are the factors that drives perception towards one interpretation of the morphos toward one parent image over the other? Now you already see how complicated this with sameness is. Not at all as easy, lacking in complexity as we usually clumsy and sloppy use the word in general discourse, especially in academia. Listen to this, Noam Chomsky, you are so very keen on sameness. Do you even understand sameness? I would say no. In this paper, we propose that perception of the averaged morph can be affected by the distinctiveness of its parents. According to the atypicality bias account, when pitted against one another, the atypical parent will exert more influence on the morphed image than the typical parent. In our framework, we conceptualize face representations as attractor fields that compete for activation of face input. Activation of a face representation is determined by the degree of fit between the face stimulus and the face representation. We hypothesize that due to their location in face space, atypical faces have broader attractor fields than typical faces. In this paper, we examine the atypicality bias generalizes to other categories besides faces. Finally, we also explore the learning trajectory of the atypicality bias and investigate how our perception of what is typical and what is atypical change as a function of learning and category experience. Faces in Euclidean face space. This is interesting, the next paragraph. By the time most people reach adulthood, they are able to recognize upwards of 1,000, if not tens of thousands of faces. A critical question is how are face representation organized in memory to support recognition that is fast, effortless, and relatively error-free. It has been proposed that faces are organized in a hyperdimensional Euclidean coordinate system, or face space, as defined by the perceptual dimensions of face stimulus. The precise dimensions of face space are not explicitly specified, but presumably correspond to the physical properties of the face, such as the length, width of the face contour, size and shape of its eyes, nose and mouth features, etc. Faces that share similar values on a given dimension are clustered close together, and faces with disparate values farther apart. A particular face is localized at a specific coordinate location in face space based on its dimensional values. Although conceptually separable, face dimensions are assumed to be perceptually integrated or holistic, such that it is difficult to attend to one dimension, for instance, distance between the eyes, without attending to the other dimensions, for instance, shape of the eyes, spacing between the nose and the mouth. At the origin of face space lies the prototypical face that represents the mean values along these dimensions. Evidence for prototype extraction comes from empirical studies showing that participants are more likely to falsely recognize a never before seen prototype, dot pattern, or face than a previously studied pattern or face. Face typicality varies as a function of distance from the origin of the space. In this coordinate system, face at the center or less typical or more unusual looking faces are located in the more peripheral regions. A critical assumption of the face space model is that face representations are normally distributed such that there is a higher density of typical face exemplars at the origin and a decreasing proportion of atypical face exemplars with increasing distance from the origin. Consequently, typical faces are assumed to be less distinctive in memory due to heightened competition from neighboring typical face representations. In contrast, atypical faces have fewer neighbors, are exposed to less competition, and are therefore more distinctive. So you understand now how distinctiveness helps sameness, because sameness is an action. Sameness, seen as only a feature of the world, is a sloppy way of thinking about sameness and identity, and it makes it hard to actually achieve sameness. And sameness is always a scale dependent thing. It's dependent on your skill at doing the face space. And I think that's marvelously interesting, and as I look at this, it becomes more and more clear that the 50-50% Morph Face, the child of George Clooney and Robert Downey Jr., looks actually more like Robert Downey Jr. than it does George Clooney. And that would mean that Robert Downey Jr. has more of the atypical face features, and that means that he has more property of possibility for sameness. I think you're starting to understand how complicated sameness and identity is, and that this journey that started 3 years ago in a bathtub on Hisingen now has advanced quite a lot since then. Now a whole cornucopia of different properties and understanding, a deepening of sameness have erupted. But if it were not, to use the subjunctive, if it were not for this first instance of revealing that sameness does not exist in that sloppy, overly exaggerated, uncareful analysis that we all have, and it's assumed without thinking, without any deepening of thought, without being present, we just say sameness. I don't know if I would have strided along this path, and this shows how utterly important these discussions has been, and also how far we have come on the way of understanding to a much greater deal how to present quantum mechanics and so forth. I won't mention quantum mechanics here now, but I understand more and more the utterly importance of the work we have done. I would not be standing here, yes, out in the woods, without that bathtub experience. Something fueled by the discussions we had. A lot of thanks to my fellow critics and appreciators and supporters. This is a development. It's never finished, and all what's gone before have been important. Nothing can be sort of pushed out of the way. The empirical results, let me take some tea here. The empirical results are consistent with a face-based account of distinctiveness. For example, demonstrated that a highly distinctive, that was Bartlett et al. And Going and Reed, demonstrated that highly distinctive faces are recognized more accurately than faces rated low in distinctiveness. Whereas atypical faces are faster to recognize due to their distinctiveness, they are slower to be categorized as faces due to their deviation from the face category prototype. I hope you really do understand this is not just about faces, that this goes much deeper than that. Valentin and Bruce and Rhodes et al. Show that face caricatures in which the features of a face are exaggerated relative to the average face prototype are recognized more readily than anti-caricatures in which distinctive features of face are diminished relative to the prototype. This view is consistent with Lewis' face-based R model, where the recognition of a specific face is determined by the number and the proximity of neighboring face exemplars in the space. In summary, the collective evidence supports the prediction of the face-based model where the clustering of representations in phase space renders typical phases less memorable and atypical phases more memorable in recognition. And I would say this goes a lot also for memory and retention, because that is very built on sameness and difference. And it's once more, sorry to repeat this once more shows the absolute disasterness of the robot model. But I have to point out that the robot model is much, much older than the robot and computers. It's been going on for a while. The oversimplification of sameness is actually the big battle between nominalists and universalists. One of the most famous examples of a nominalist is, to a certain extent, Duns Scotus, one of the few nominalists. But I had to say it's not that easy as the battle between nominalists and universalists does. It would be much closer to the pointing done by Wittgenstein, because it has to be pointing more than an explanation. And what he does is not a battle for nominalism, not a battle for universalism. He actually shows that there are unintended limits to our understanding of these things, and he opens up some of those limits and makes it possible to go further. And that's what he means by, once the book has been understood, it can be left aside and we can develop our skills. That's what he's saying. We can once more be part of the world and go further. The phase space concept has been explored in After Effects paradigms, where prolonged exposure to an adapting phase stimulus causes systematic bias in the perception of a subsequent test phase. For example, adapting to a contracted phase causes a normal phase to appear expanded. So like a contracted, compressed phase, if you get used to seeing phases like that in a photo book, you will all of a sudden see that normal phases tend to expand. But this will also make an Asian face appear more Caucasian and a male face appear more female. Because females usually have more expanded faces, and also Caucasians have more expanded faces. Identity-specific after effects have been demonstrated in which exposure to an individual face enhances recognition of the face lying directly opposite to adapting face in phase space, i.e. its anti-face. And here also, when I speak about anti-face, you understand more thoroughly that antonyms, contradictions are not at all as simple. So we started in a way that is turned upside down in a way, but we learn now that sameness is not as simple as we usually think. And it takes a lot more engagement, takes a lot more intention from our view, because the normal way of seeing is coming from knowledge itself, I would say, a traditional knowledge that sort of stopped knowing, stopped understanding. It doesn't have to be that way. We can actually expand understanding and seeing through those limits, and then our process of understanding more will progress more and more and more. Will never stop, I'd say. And this is what makes one really happy with this lecture, is it's an indication that there is not a final word, but it's something, and that could be a disappointment in the beginning. A couple of years ago that was a disappointment for me, because as long as you're stuck in the passivity model, you want the final answer. But less and less I feel that to be the case within myself. I don't need this final answer at all to the same degree as I used to. This is slowly, little by little, disappearing from my needs. And this might be an even better explanation of what is the metaphysics of presence. It's this general tendency for sloppiness and brute force, but it's also something that is obvious in oneself when one is tired, one is irritated, lacking in energy, not wanting to think things through because they are just troublesome, they are annoying. Thinking takes a lot of energy. Thinking is one of the most energy consuming things we could do. So there are very good reasons for these simplifications, and still they take away so much of our perception, our reality, and I think that's just sort of a growing phase I had. Maybe you have it yourself, where you still look for a definite answer, and sometimes people will ask you for a definite answer. You can give it, but you don't have to believe it in it 100%. And sometimes a definite answer is usually the best answer also. There are different levels to ordinary language. There's never an absolute hindrance to give a definite answer whether a cat is dead or alive. But you understand what I mean? This is an opening up, and at the same time as you answer truthfully and honestly about the cat existence, or whether you recognize a face or not, you can also see at the very same time the complexities. So this way of thinking is not excluding anything. It would actually been an exclusion if Wittgenstein were to give a definite answer to what is sameness, what is intention, what is extension. All those things are sloppy things. They are brute. They are often before the fact as well. And they obscure more than they reveal. You can even say that they are not very helpful. There are more helpful ways of going about things. Identity-specific after effects have been demonstrated in which exposure to an individual face enhances recognition of the face lying directly opposite to adapting face in face space. Anti-face. It did actually survive a repetition for my sake here. For instance, adapting to a face with narrow eyes and a small pointed chin will enhance the perception of a face with broad eyes and a large rounded chin. This is anti-Fred. The point-eyed chin is Fred. To account for face-specific adaptation effects, it has been proposed that faces lie on the trajectory defined by individual face. The prototypical face and the anti-faces on opposite side of the face space, and this family of faces is systematically affected by the adaptation manipulation, such that adapting to anti-Fred renders the prototypical face to appear more like Fred. Critically, adaptation effects do not generalize to other faces that are proximal to the target face in phase space, but are located off the trajectory. Collectively, results from phase after effects studies provide compelling evidence that phases are stored in multidimensional phase space with the prototypical phase lying at its origin. And here you should also note this very important phase space. Remember how we talked about space earlier, that mental space is also space. Here we understand more and more that actually making a distinction between something is mental, whatever that is, we can ask now, whatever is mental. I think it's Lars who's usually saying, if I hear consciousness, I uncock my gun. Take off the safety of my gun. There's good reason for the good Hawkins saying that, and that's the other Hawkins, Hawkins the physician. I think consciousness is one of those terms similar to sameness, identity, and contradiction that are sloppy. They do not show the true reality of the deeper things. They take away the most interesting features of our reality, makes us tense. Yes, there is tension going on. I think tension is the lack of thinking, of depth in reality. Like me being out of breath here, it's a Sunday. It was a really striving Sunday. I've been doing my first excursion when it comes to wild herb this year, and the first one ever under no supervision from Christopher or any of the others that helped me before. So that was a great step. But I'm still sort of compressed after this experience. And by just letting space come in again, I learned to understand, and this is a point coming from Stephen Wolfram, somebody who I can actually recommend. I hope I remember to put in a link from Stephen Wolfram. He's a still living British physicist, and he says, to do calculation, space is enough. We don't need existences. And I would say existences, sameness, difference, taken on a very superficial level, will block out the deeper understanding of what space is. And phase space is an absolutely wondrous idea on good take, a good way of understanding something that is so complicated otherwise. It cannot be understood without a practical example, and therefore phases. I actually remember this not only from Wittgenstein. I kept coming to Wittgenstein because this is coming from empiricism or research into the subject, but this is actually repeating what Wittgenstein said. But by doing this, I also understand how hard it will be to have an understanding from these reading philosophical investigations. You need a lot more coming from the real world. These pinpoints that Wittgenstein put in his very small book actually, and it is simply not enough. Not at all enough. Well, let me continue here. A second prediction of the phase space model is the similarity of phase stimulus is a linear function of its distance in Euclidean space. That is, the closer a phase input is to a stored phase representation, the more likely it is to be identified with that phase. Phase morphs provide a good test for the Euclidean prediction. In the morphing process, two faces are graphically averaged to produce a child morph face. That's the 50-50 George Clooney and Robert Downey Jr. The physical face morph varies as a function of the relative contributions of the parent images. For example, an 80-20% morph that receives 80% contribution from parent A and 20% contribution from parent B will lie closer to parent A than parent B in face space, and should therefore bear a stronger resemblance to the parent A image. The 50-50 morph face, i.e. a morph face that receives equal contribution from both parent faces, presents an interesting test of recognition because it lies an equal distance, listen to this, equal distance from both parent faces, and therefore should be perceived as equally similar to both parents. And therefore, as discussed in the next section, although the Euclidean prediction of similarity are straightforward, the empirical evidence suggests that the nearest neighbor is not the only factor that determines how similar or different two faces appear. The next paragraph is getting more and more interesting. Faces and the atypicality bias. Tanaka et al. From 1998, this is going to be a request from the UB library, used the delayed match to sample task to test the assumption of the attractor field model that distinctive category members possess larger attractor fields than typical members. Tanaka et al. Identify a set of typical, atypical and distinctive faces through pilot testing, and morphed each typical face with each distinctive face of the same gender. This is coming from figure 2. Not the clearest picture. To construct a morph of the atypical and atypical parent faces, corresponding control points were identified on the two parent images. E.g., the corner of the left eye on the parent face image 1 and parent face image 2. The number of control points for facial features were kept constant, with 12 points on the mouth, 7 points on each eye, 6 points on the nose, 5 points on each eyebrow, 22 points for the outline on the face. According to the level of morphing, new control points for the morph face were defined by moving the specified distance along a vector connecting the control points in parent images. The location of intervening pixels were linearly interpolated across the surface based on the position of the nearest control point. A fade process was then employed in which the brightness values for each corresponding pixel were weighted according to the contribution of each parent image. This procedure yielded 8 morphs, each containing an equal physical contribution from its two parents, 1 typical, 1 distinctive. The Tanaka et al. Paradigm tested whether the morph face would be judged more similar to the atypical parent, as would be predicted by the attractor field model. On each trial, a pair of parent faces were presented as opposing sides of the computer screen for 2.5 seconds. The parents were replaced with a morph of the pair for 1 second, after which the morph disappeared, and participants indicated whether it more closely resembled the parent presented on the right or the parent presented on the left. The measure of interest was the percentage of trials on which the atypical parent was chosen. In the most straightforward version of the task, participants indicated that the atypical parent was more similar to the morph on 60% of the trials, and significantly, in that case, significantly greater than the 50% chance level that would be expected if the morph appeared equally similar to the typical and atypical parents. Was the atypical parent chosen more often than the typical parent because it was perceived to be more similar to the morph, or simply because it was more memorable than the typical parent? To address this question, Tanaka et al. Added an unrelated condition in which two parent stimuli were followed by the morph of a different set of parents. When the participants viewed related morphs, they selected the atypical parent on 63% of the trials, replicating the atypicality bias. When viewing unrelated morphs, however, they choose the typical parent on 60% of trials. This result suggested that the atypicality bias observed in experiment 1 and the related condition on experiment 2 were not due to the preferential choosing of the more memorable parent. If memorability alone drove responses, and atypicality bias would be expected in the unrelated condition as well. Instead, atypicality bias was observed, a sensible result given that a randomly selected morph is likely to be more similar to a typical face than an atypical face. Experiment 3 demonstrated an atypicality bias when the morph and the parents were presented simultaneously, providing further evidence that the phenomenon is perceptually driven rather than memory driven. Isn't that interesting? So let me recap this whole thing. Now is the juicy details. Let me see where in the time limit we are now. Oh, it's a very long episode. 108. So what happened here is that we've been comparing, Tanaka been comparing photos that are happenstantial, we don't know them, and he wants to compare what is typical and what is atypical, and use these photos to sort of discuss what is deconstruction, you could say. What is the very working principle of deconstruction? How is sameness and how is atypicality? And he made this artificial, so to speak, or general face space. And to sort of recognize, to see what is the perceptual locus for atypicality bias, and what does he find out? He finds out that memory is not a part of recognizing faces. Isn't that just extraordinary? And this is previously we had a punch to the memory idea, the idea of memories being robot-like or sucked up somewhere from moments, and now we get an uppercut. And the uppercut is that recognizing faces is not from memory. It's not from previous ideas. It is actually stored within the face as well. It's stored on the outside of our inner thing. And once more, we are deconstructing the subject-object polarity in a way that is most interesting. And this shows that deconstruction goes into every subject on Earth. There's no part of knowledge that is excluded. And it's also the case that no knowledge ever should be excluded from deconstruction, because it brings more knowledge to our world. So without fractality even being mentioned for a second, or deconstruction obviously not being mentioned either, we are going into exactly those things and nothing else. We are looking into attractive field. It's just marvelous how these terms are coming up that are almost like coming from chaos theory, and there's no connection to chaos theory, not as such, but is rather we are learning reality. Chaos theory is not a specific theory. It is what we always already known about reality, somewhere within ourselves. It doesn't have a special flavor, it's not an ideology. Chaos theory can be recognized in every subject. And that also would in the end point to that chaos theory is not a verbalized theory. It needs to be a verbalized theory at some level, but if you go down deeper, it will be something embodied that you can use in whatever circumstances you are coming into, and it can also, and this is even more interesting, could be used to gain higher consciousness. And that's the only way to get to higher consciousness. It will be to this deconstruction. It's been going on too long, but this is just too interesting. A second goal of experiment 3 was to examine the perceptual locus of the atypicality bias, given the typical phases are assumed to be recognized on the basis of configural properties, while atypical phases are often perceived as such based on a particular distinctive feature. Inversion provides a means of measuring the relative contribution of each type of processing to the atypicality bias. Because inversion is thought to disrupt configural more than feature processing, the atypicality bias should be attenuated, alltså förtunnad, with inverted stimuli to the extent that configural processing underlies the effect. Tanaka et al. Added test blocks in which the stimuli were inverted and observed an atypicality bias that was significant, 55%. That's 10% more than pure chance, but diminished relative to magnitude of the effect for upright phases to 62%. Concluded that both configural and feature processing play a role in the perception that the morph is more similar to the atypical parent. In the attractor field model, the attractor basin surrounding each stimulus is demarcated by a boundary signifying a point in similarity space at which a stimuli input will activate either of two representations with equal probability. The disparity in the similarities of the morph to its typical and atypical parents suggests that the boundary between the parents is not located at their midpoint. Where then does the boundary or point of subjective equality, PSE, between a typical and atypical exemplar lie? Question mark. Experiment 4 explore this issue by creating morphs with unequal contributions from the typical and atypical parent, e.g. 55% typical, 45% atypical, 60-40, 65-35. something that could be seen here. This could be the first experiment to really get into deconstruction, and not intentionally, we're just in deconstruction anyway. Interpolating from the atypicality bias observed in the various morphs combination conditions, concluded that the morph containing 63% contribution from a typical parent and 33% contribution from an atypical parent is the PSE, where the morph is perceived to bear equal resemblance to both parents. The outcome suggests a boundary of roughly 2/3 of the distance between the atypical and the typical parent for the phase stimuli used by Tanaka and colleague. In a later experience from 2007, Tanaka and Cornell tested a simple yet important prediction of the attractor field model. If a morph is considered more similar to its atypical parent than its typical parent, it should be more difficult to discriminate from its atypical parent than its typical parent. Because 50-50% morphs are highly distinctive from both parents, can be identified as such with near ceiling accuracy. Wow, really good accuracy. The comparison of interest concern morphs with unequal contributions. For example, a 70% atypical and 30% typical morph should be more difficult to discriminate from its atypical parent than a 30% atypical and 70% typical morph should be discriminated from its typical parent. This prediction falls out of the assumption that atypical exemplars possesses the largest attractor fields. The probability that a morph position some distance from its atypical parent will fall within the large field of that atypical parent is greater than the probability that a morph positioned at the same distance from its typical parent will fall within that typical parent's smaller field. And now it's going to get even more complicated, and that's going to be more expounded in the next lecture. But how will it affect if we get into non-Euclidean phase space? That is a phase space where the closest or the shortest route between point A and B is not a straight line. Can you have any imagination what the complexity level, how much the complexity level will rise after that? And this clearly shows that similarity, difference, depth of understanding, and how much it actually demands of us as perceiving, thinking, projecting human beings takes. And that sheer laziness and also our inborn trait of not using our brains too much, which is not an insignificant factor, especially in the learning period. And this is why these 1,000 lectures have been so important, because this wouldn't have been possible without these recordings. Completely impossible. Because how can you put yourself into all this? It's just when you start understanding and you start training your head in these directions, you actually reach reality. And then your rewards will start coming. And then it will be easier to engage more mental force to think about these things. This is not it's not very similar with physical training. There you don't have that curve. You can train a little, you can gain a little, and you can continue that way. This doesn't work with the mental force, because it takes a great time until you reach a level when you can start dissolving these limits. It actually took I would say 700 or 800 episodes before that is becoming more and more an effect. And that, of course, was fueled, as I said so many times before, by Rodolphe Gachet, Robert Magliola, and the underlying understanding that we already have from Derrida, Martin Heidegger, and the work we had previously with case theory and all that. I wouldn't be able to understand this without the extensive training we did on chaos theory in the cabin down there between Herrljunga and Vårgårda, in Eggvena it's called. This is just too interesting. How can it be interesting? Well, it's interesting because the underlying striata now, it's so complex, so it responds to these things. I have to say thank you very much for your patience. It's one of these longest episodes. I would put some links in the connotation underneath. I say thank you very much and have a very, very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.